On the road, in the gym, at a coffee house. No matter where you listen, this is Prevention Perk. I'm Steve Miller with Mid-America PTTC. It's time to perk up our prevention efforts. My guest today is Angela Weeks, Project Director for SAMHSA's Center of Excellence on LGBTQ plus behavioral health equity. Angela brings extensive national experience creating, implementing, and evaluating programs and initiatives that improve the lives of LGBTQ plus people and communities. She also has extensive experience supporting LGBTQ plus populations experiencing homelessness and the juvenile justice system. She holds a doctorate in business administration from the University of Maryland's Global Campus and a master's in public administration from the University of Southern California. Hello, Angela, and welcome to Prevention Perk.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
This is going to be a fun conversation. We'll start unpacking why here in just a minute, but I always am intrigued by how people got into the role that they are serving in today. What was that path like to the leadership of SAMHSA's Center of Excellence and kind of to the path of the work that you do? What's that been like?
I love that question. My path is very windy. I started my work in the military. I was a combat medic for almost 10 years in the Army. And my passion for advocating for LGBTQ people came from serving in the military under the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. So that policy was in effect most of the time I was in. And it was really just awful. It was just awful to live under a policy where you could not be honest about yourself or your relationships, and especially in an organization that moved you around frequently and would only move you with your family if you were married. So it was a challenging time, and I got out of the military and really wanted to do so much more for the LGBTQ community. So I started volunteering at the Los Angeles LGBT Center, which was the largest, and I think still is the largest LGBT community center in the world. And so I went there and found out that there were LGBTQ young people who were overrepresented in homeless populations and overrepresented in foster care. And I wanted to know more and I wanted to help. And that sort of got me into this work.
You're listening to Prevention Perk. The funder of this project, along with all the other products of the Mid-America PTTC, is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Although funded by SAMHSA, the content of this recording does not necessarily reflect the views of SAMHSA. Searching for resources on LGBTQI+ population? SAMHSA's focused efforts on this topic include national survey reports, agency and federal initiatives, and related behavioral health resources. There is a link in our show notes, or search samhsa.gov/behavioral health equity/LGBTQI. Well, this is a big issue, and that's kind of the direction that you and I are taking. We're going to talk about this through 4 different episodes across Pride Month for 2024. And there's a lot to unpack, but I'm curious, you represent both National SOGI Center and the Center of Excellence on LGBTQ+. Help me understand the acronyms, what those entities do both separately, and then how do they kind of converge together?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll start with our Center of Excellence for LGBTQ plus behavioral health equity. This is a SAMHSA-funded center, and our goal is to provide behavioral health professionals all the tools and training and resources that they need to serve LGBTQ plus people better. So we know that LGBTQ community members have higher rates of mental health disparities. So it's really important to get the right kind of training and resources to the professionals serving them. And that's just, we house that work under the National SOGI Center, which is a larger initiative that we lead, but is really a collaboration of national organizations across the country doing work with LGBTQ populations. And we all come together under the National SOGI Center to streamline the work, to create more cohesiveness among us so that providers and families and young people who are seeking support just have to go to one place. They go to the National SOGI Center and we connect them to the national partners or regional partners that can help them with whatever they need. So it's our effort at making the work more cohesive and so that folks don't have to remember who do you go to for training and who do you go to for policy help and who do you go to if you need a clinician. Just go to one place, the National SOGI Center, and then we'll help you get wherever you need to be.
So for Pride Month, we're partnering with you and some of your colleagues on a variety of different topics under the LGBTQ plus umbrella. And I know that if you read any of the social media channels or you read the headlines, there's all kinds of voices out there, this, that, and the other, pro, con, right, wrong, bad, good, all of that. What I'd like to know are what are really some of the, from your vantage point, what are some of the disparities that people in the LGBTQ plus community face? And what are some of those that I mean, there's really consistency to them. Like you could say, these really exist. We know this is the talking points that we should address with some factuality.
Yeah. Well, first, I'll just say I love that you said LGBTQ plus umbrella. That's really perfect because the one of the points of contention, I think, within our community and also folks outside of the community is this acronym is always evolving and changing, and depending on what organization you're working with or what you might be reading or watching, you might hear or see different acronyms. So I'll explain the one that I use. So I use LGBTQ plus, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning. And then there's a plus at the end of it because it really is an umbrella acronym. The plus is there to signify there's lots of different words that people use to describe their sexual orientation and gender identity, and they're not always represented equally in the acronym. So the plus is that acknowledgement while still maintaining some brevity. So a lot of people, have questions about that. And for our work, we're very focused on ending disparities of people who are involved in deep end systems like the child welfare system, the juvenile justice system, homelessness, and very focused on improving access to behavioral health care. So all of the data that I'm seeped in my work is focused in those areas. So I can say that LGBTQ young people are overrepresented in foster care. Nearly, we know that about 30% of young people who are in foster care, ages 12 to 21, identify as LGBTQ. We know that there are very high numbers in the juvenile justice system, somewhere around 20% of young people in that system. And when we look at numbers of young people experiencing homelessness, the number jumps up pretty high to 40% of young people experiencing homelessness identify as LGBTQ. And that's there's a number of reasons why that could be, but one of the primary reasons that we know is just a lack of community and support, a lack of family acceptance, experiencing higher rates of discrimination, which causes circumstances that lead young people into these systems or into experiencing homelessness. And I don't want to overburden you with data, but the other thing I'll say is that as far as health disparities go, we have consistently, year after year after year, have shown that LGBTQ people suffer higher rates of suicidality, depression, anxiety, harmful substance use. And this increases, the rates increase the more an LGBTQ person is in an environment where they are experiencing increased levels of harassment and discrimination and rejection from their communities and families. So we know that there's a relationship between how much discrimination someone experiences and these negative health outcomes. And the reason that I say that is because there are a lot of people who would think LGBTQ people are just, they experience higher rates of depression or substance use because they are LGBTQ. And that's not true at all. We know that the disparities directly stem from just the stress and hardships they experience as a result of discrimination.
That clarifies something for me. I'm glad that you said that because I hear that a lot, and I maybe am guilty of even thinking that a lot of this is attributed to the fact that it's LGBTQ and that's why they have this, but it's these external factors that are complicating and are leading to higher levels of depression or anxiety or suicide.
Yeah. And we know that's the case because we see, even on the flip side, LGBTQ people that are in affirming supportive environments don't have these high rates of negative health outcomes. So we can see that they're very much, those two things are very much related.
So I'm curious, you said that there's a high percentage of youth that are in foster care or juvenile justice. Is that if they end up in that foster care situation, is that because they have just been ostracized or abandoned by a family member because of their identification, or how do they end up in that system?
There are a lot of pathways. So we see that there are some young people who do say that the family conflict related to them being in foster care was because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So they might have come out to family and then suffered physical abuse as a result of that, or they may have their families themselves might have called in for the child welfare system to intervene because the young person's behaviors were concerning to them. And sometimes these behaviors are just that related to their sexual orientation or gender identity, like them wanting to date or any number of things in that realm. We also see that sometimes young people anticipate rejection, or they could be experiencing rejection and they run away from home, and that leads them into these systems. Um, Another thing we see is that young people who are already in the child welfare system, even at very young ages, they tend to be there for longer periods of time and move around more frequently because of their LGBTQ identity. And so all of that creates an incredible amount of instability for this population, which means that they might have entered the foster care system for any reason, but they linger in care because of their LGBTQ identity. For example, not having foster homes that are affirming of them. And so they can constantly get moved. And the more they get moved, the more um, they may lose hope, right? There may be behavioral conditions that come up that make it harder for them to exit care. So there's a few different factors within that.
So I want to talk a little bit about the coming out process. I grew up, I'm getting to the age where I can think about retirement. So I grew up a long time ago in a small town. Denial was pervasive. I think homophobia was humorous. And if I had any knowledge of what the coming out process was, or even of people that would identify as being gay, it was very little. So I'm curious, what's that process like for an individual to go from the anticipation or expectation is they're going to be, I hate to say normal, but what we identify as typical, and then all of a sudden they start identifying differently. What's that look like? How does that play itself out?
Well, I think, at least speaking from my own experience, there's a moment perhaps where you are identifying for yourself that you are LGBTQ, and that moment of realization for yourself can be pretty terrifying because in that moment you are running through your head all of the people who you care about and who might support you and which people aren't going to support you and what you might have to lose if you are in fact LGBTQ or if you tell people about it, and all these things start swimming around in your head. And and it just causes a lot of stress and worry. So there's a little bit of a process where you have to come to terms with it yourself and figure out, what am I feeling? Am I LGBTQ or what am I going through, right? So there's a lot of questioning that happens with the individual. And then at some point, at least for me, I felt, okay, this is who I am. Like I don't have a doubt about it. This is who I am. This is who I'm attracted to. And now I have to figure out what my life looks like. So coming out to others, how do I do that? And who am I going to lose? And there were, thankfully, in my situation, way more people who supported me than not. I might have lost a few people along the way, but the people closest to me, my family, my mother and grandmother, everybody was so supportive. And I was so thankful. And I will say that even though I had a supportive family, it didn't make coming out necessarily less terrifying for me. It took me many, many, many years of practice before I got more comfortable with telling people who I was, because there's always, or there was always, this fear of, am I putting myself in danger? Is this going to impact my work? What are people going to say about me? Because for for most of us, our entire lives, we hear negative messages about LGBTQ people. So we have to have this layer. We just have to look out for our safety, right? And be protective. And so coming out then becomes a lifelong process. You have to navigate coming out at every doctor's appointment if you care for your doctor to know about you and your needs. You have to come out at new jobs when anybody asks about your family structure, if you're married, if you're going to have kids. You have to come out with each new school, perhaps. And in the case of young people in foster care, because that's the world that I live in a lot, they have to come out at every new placement, every new caseworker. And so it's lifelong. And even now that I'm nearly 40 years into my life, I still get a little nervous when I have to come out to providers at doctors' appointments. And I take a lot of care in choosing my providers now, and going online and doing extensive research about where did they go to school? Was it in a liberal area? Was it in a school that was LGBTQ affirming? Where did they get their degree? Because I'm trying to assess whether I am going to have additional stress when I disclose my identity to them. So I guess, in a nutshell, it's lifelong, right? The process, and you kind of have to learn how to measure your safety as you navigate that process. And then there's just a lot of fear sometimes that comes with trying to contemplate and predict who's going to stick around with you and who's not.
You're listening to Prevention Perk. A podcast is like a breakout session from your daily routine. It's a unique way to perk up your prevention efforts. We'd like to hear from you. Please send your comment, topic, or guest suggestion to midamericapttc@gmail.com. So if we can go back, and if you're okay talking about this, you said that personally coming to the realization of your identity, my internally, I immediately thought, I don't know what your age was. I don't know if that's a factor, but did you just know, or was it a combination of things that you'd heard societally, things that you knew from your community, from your friend set, that kind of stuff? That moment where you're just like, oh, this is how I'm different from other people, or what the expectation would happen to be. I mean, or was it just more like, I just know that this is who I am, and you just realize that? I was just curious, like, how does that really, bubble up?
Yeah. I think it's different. It's somewhat different for everyone. Though there's some research on like development that shows a through line for most people. For example, your sexual orientation generally forms in childhood around like 6 to 12. Usually, like if I were to ask you, do you remember how old you were when you had your first crush?
Yeah. Are
Do
you
you feel
asking the age? Yeah, I
Yeah,
was.
yes.
It would have been third grade. I don't know what age that would be, like 8.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
that's pretty typical. So any listener thinking about when was it that you first had your first crush, we can usually remember it because it's a pretty like big moment in our lives, right?
right.
Um, and that's when your sexual orientation starts to develop. Not that there's any necessarily any sexual attraction at such a young age, but you get like, little butterflies, or
Yeah.
you always want to be around the one person you got a crush on. And so we know that it forms pretty early, but what happens for LGBTQ young people, um, or I should say lesbian, gay, bisexual young people, is that they'll notice that they have attraction to someone of the same gender, and then instead of running home and being like, I have a crush on Bobby, they'll hide it and they won't talk about it because they've already gotten messages that it's taboo. um, and so then they'll, continue on in their development. And at some point, their feelings of attraction will go stronger. And now puberty hits. And usually this is when young people decide to come out as LGBTQ if they feel comfortable and safe enough to do so. So that was my story. In high school, I remember early years, I did not get any of my friends who started dating. I was like, what is the big deal? Like I was just not
You weren't feeling
in
it.
that mindset
Yeah.
at all. I was like, I don't get what all the hoopla is about these guys. And it just didn't make sense to me until I met a girl who I had an insane crush on. And I immediately was like, oh my gosh. Number one, thank goodness I'm not broken. Because I thought, oh, maybe I'm incapable of being in a relationship because I'm not anywhere where my friends are. Um, so there was a little bit of relief, like, oh, I can feel this and I do get it, but I don't get it in the same way my friends do. And then there was this flood of like, oh my gosh, I don't know, for me anyways, I didn't know anybody else in the like at all that was LGBTQ. So I had to sort of figure out for myself, like, what am I supposed to do now? Right. But at that moment in high school, when I first realized it, I also was like, oh, I can trace this back to my first crush. But until high school, I wasn't able to do that because I had disassociated so much from those early memories. So this is a complicated answer to just say it forms pretty early for people, right? But for lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, sometimes you don't realize that's what it is until much later.
Well, as you explain that, because this is often what the argument might be or the statement might be publicly is, well, they made a choice to live that way. But as you describe that, to me, that's the reason I was curious. It's like, it seems very organic. It's like maybe some people just go, oh, this is who I am. And they don't really they haven't figured out the societal context and all that. And others, it's a process of both of those things. But neither one of them, it sounds to me like it was okay, so I want apples today instead of oranges, and I want to drive Chevy, not a Ford, and I want to date girls or whatever. It's like it's not a choice. It's an organic expression of just who the person is. Am I saying that right?
Yeah. And the easiest way for me to describe it is to actually talk about what do we mean when we say we fall in love with someone, or what do we mean when we say we have a crush on someone? If we could define attraction and feelings, it's like you get nervous around them, you're elated, you have like euphoric happiness, you have butterflies in your stomach, and your heart is pounding faster. All these things that are pretty great, but not really controllable, right? Like if you could stop your butterflies or make your heart stop racing, that would be pretty phenomenal. But at the end of the day, we can't do that, right? And so I
Right.
think that's the easiest way to describe
Yeah.
the feelings.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So we talked earlier a little bit. The subject was disparities and some of the barriers, and I already know, but there's social hardships that are faced by LGBTQ plus individuals, and I live in a pretty conservative community that I would say kind of aligns itself with what would be traditional faith, family, race, politics, that kind of thing. How do you think that that traditional line of life pushes back and makes it harder to accept or even be tolerant of people that are LGBTQ plus?
Yeah.
I mean,
That's a good
that's a big
question. Yeah.
question. I mean, because that's it's multifaceted. I mean, faith's pretty pervasive where I live, but there's family values nationwide. And then, I live in a conservative area of race and of politics. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the first thing that I think about is the tradition and what we consider traditional. And I think that what's interesting, and a lot of people don't know this, but across the globe, there's been documentation of LGBTQ people. They weren't necessarily called that, but there's been documentation of same gender relationships or of people who inhabited perhaps like a third gender or another type of gender as far back as like human history is recorded. And in many cultures around the world, there has been an acknowledgement that sexual orientation and gender identity is very diverse. And in many cultures, it was celebrated until pretty recent history. So in recent history, these identities were stigmatized, but it wasn't always that way. So I think that's kind of interesting when you say like traditional families and traditional beliefs. What we're really talking about is sort of like modern American tradition, right? Um, so when one thing that I would say is that LGBTQ people exist everywhere, even in conservative spaces, even in your faith communities, even in your rural communities. LGBTQ people exist and have always existed. Whether you know it or not is just a matter of do those people feel safe, right? Safe around you or safe in the community. And so, with that in mind, LGBTQ people in your communities, many people, they want that connection to their rural community. They want the connection to their faith community. They want what we would consider to be a healthy, robust, safe, successful family, right? They want all of those things you just listed. And and it's just unfortunate that the circumstances, the discrimination they experience in these spaces has created this dynamic where they leave, right? Many people either decide to hide their identities so that they don't have to give up their faith communities or families or any of that. But of the people that don't decide to hide their identities, they often leave to more liberal spaces. So I guess as you ask that question about what about these communities with conservative ideas or more traditional ideas, I would just say you have good community members that you care about around you that do identify and you just don't know it. And it's a loss to the community um, and to really each of us to not know those people better.
it kind of oversimplifies it, I'm sure, but everybody at the end of the day really wants to just feel like they belong somewhere, like in a community or amongst a peer group or whatever that looks like in a church. We all just want to belong somewhere. And it creates that hardship, I would imagine, that if you're in a situation where no one around you or you haven't found those persons around you, that you have to go somewhere else, move away or relocate to, another state or wherever that is, because we're always going to move towards wanting to feel like we fit in somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And my hope for the future is that LGBTQ people would feel that in their small towns and in their rural communities and in their, whatever political group they affiliate with. Like, LGBTQ people have lots of different ideas and we come in all different kinds of variety, right? And there's people who are very, very embedded in their faith that are LGBTQ. And I think it's really hard to separate out the topics sometimes, even though sort of politically on like a national debate scale, we often separate them. right? Like LGBTQ people can't be religious or religious people can't be accepting of LGBTQ people. I don't think that that's not how we live our lives, right? We're very enmeshed and intermingled. We just don't really talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. You and I talked about this, but in just doing this series that we're doing all month and just having these conversations, I mean, I'm kind of a novice. I'm not an expert on any of these topics that we'll be discussing and exploring. But the more I thought about it, I realized just in my lifetime how much more recognized um, different identities are. And in thinking about that, I thought just how resilient people are in trying to find that place that they belong. And so from, the work that you're doing, what does that resilience look like? Like if you could describe what this collective body is doing to just rise up and stake their claim, so to speak, what does that resilience look like where you sit?
Yeah. I think it just I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that people are waking up and living, right? That is an act of resilience. Especially in a time where there is so much debate about the about whether trans people, for example, should exist, right? And if they're real and if um, their identities are valid. There's so much national debate right now about that. And to be a trans person hearing this often, I'm sure is very difficult. We see in the data that in recent years, hate crimes against this population have increased, rates of suicide have increased. Um, and for me, when trans people wake up and live their lives and get married and start families and go after the career that they love and engage in the hobbies that they love, that those are all acts of resilience. Um, and I think the same of LGBTQ people generally, but for right now, it's a particularly hard time, I think, to be trans in America.
So from the outside, because I'm asking these questions, I live a lifestyle that's different. How do we support this? How do we add to the resilience as opposed to fighting against it? I don't know if there's I'm not a guideline or blueprint, but how do we be supportive of this? What's the best way to go about being inclusive?
Yeah, I think, first, if anyone's listening to this, that's already great, right? Like, thank you for listening to this conversation, because it means you're interested, you're curious, you're open to hearing different perspectives, and that means a ton. And the more that we can just like learn about each other's lives and histories and experiences, the better we all understand each other, the more open and loving we can all be towards one another, which we all need a little bit more of, I think, in the world. And so educating yourself, listening to other perspectives is really important. And then I would also just encourage um, people to think about, do you know anyone who's LGBTQ and are you close to them? Do you hang out with them? Do you know their lives and their worries and their dreams and all of that? Because if you do, um, you probably have a good understanding of how much misinformation is out there about this community and how untrue so many stereotypes are, right? But for the people who don't have LGBTQ people in their life, they've never been around them extensively, had no exposure to the community, then I would ask you to approach or consider your biases, your beliefs about the population with a fair amount of skepticism, because you really don't know what LGBTQ people are like unless you know LGBTQ people. Right? And even then, we're all very different, right? So just, the stereotypes that are out there, all of the misinformation, and how there are certain people with big platforms that might take stereotypes and try to politicize the lives of LGBTQ people. It's just so unfair to judge a population based off of this information. The best way to know us is to go hang out within the community, go make a friend, go hang out with your gay cousin or your trans cousin more or something, to really like learn about our lives.
You're listening to Prevention Perk. Our partner for this series is the Center of Excellence on LGBTQ behavioral health equity. Their support and dedication with helping us recognize and celebrate Pride Month has been invaluable. The Center of Excellence has created a resource page filled with links to webinars and other tools to help us all enhance our knowledge and navigate healthy conversations about the LGBTQ topics we explore in this series. Learn more by searching lgbtqequity.org/June 2024 podcast series. So is there anything that we haven't talked about that, you want to make sure the audience knows about? You're highly educated. You work diligently to elevate these individuals in our community. You're the sage on the stage. What's your final thought for us, Angela?
Well, I think, again, I just appreciate the opportunity to talk about this from a personal perspective too, because so much of my work and my day is about research and about advocacy for the population. But I appreciated a moment to just kind of talk about things from my lens and experience. And really grateful for folks who have tuned in to listen to this, and just want to offer that I've been educating people on this topic for, at least 12 years. And there's no question that surprises me, and there's no misconception that is going to hurt my feelings at this point. And so I just like to offer myself as a resource for those that are listening that have questions that may be too nervous to ask them, not sure if they can ask them, not sure if there's a right way or a wrong way to say things. My information will be posted somewhere on this webpage, I'm sure. And just want to offer, you can reach out, you can ask me questions. And I'm very grateful for opportunities to have discussions with people, especially for those who are trying to understand it and have never really had a space to, safely talk about it. So I'm here for it. So that's what I'll leave.
My guest on this episode has been Angela Weeks, and you will find some links in our show notes to connect with her, along with a link to an insightful video that she shared with us. So thank you, Angela, for being here. And thank you for listening to Prevention Perk, a podcast from Mid-America PTTC. To learn more about our innovations, visit pttcnetwork.org and look under your PTTC for the Mid-America link. Remember, prevention is better together, and together we are stronger.